just for you already here, I apologize. I've got the sniffles and my head is working completely, totally right. That might make me say a few more interesting things in a more interesting way, hopefully not annoying. I might mute myself. I'm so pleased to be able to have Michael and of course Liz enter her book here for the people who, well, you've probably seen their picture, but this is a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's also available on audio for anybody if you wanted that. And however, we have Michael and Liz. Thank you so much. If you haven't already read the book description, Grant's work invites us to ask searching questions. What does the Bible look like after inerrancy? Do you have to give up scripture when you no longer believe in its literal interpretations? Can you call it sacred while renegotiating your relationship with the church? In said book, Liz wrestles with these questions and offering readers a fresh vision of encountering God in scripture, even as faith continues to shift and evolve. And you're also going to notice things like, just these people here, hearing about, as well as scripture, you're going to hear about whales and cosmology and other things. So it's a really interesting, the way that you introduce things, Liz, to these little stories and paintings and like the doomsday stuff, which I'll have a question on later, really evoking some of these images. Really, really, really enjoyable. Thank you for writing this and making it available to people who have honest questions and need to hear from people who are soft and gentle and allow for questions to be asked, and you can still be a Christian. I mean, I thankfully don't come from that background. And so when I hear some people talk about, oh, Christianity is this thing where you can't ask questions and it's all anti this and it's pro that, like, man, I don't know where that came from, but I know that it exists. And so for people who deal with that, Liz, thank you. Housekeeping, we will go for around the 1.5 hour mark. We'll do an hour between Liz and Michael, maybe a little bit for me, and then 30 minutes Q&A from everyone else. If you please kindly send your questions to admin. And the reason I do that is because when I do the recording, I read them out and then it makes the editing a little bit better. So please, you can start sending questions at any time. Excuse me. I think with that, I have got everything attached. I was going to say, Liz, you already do the whole, the question thing. I look very seriously, Liz. Now, Liz is this person who's written this very, very important book. And the question would be, so why did you write this book that you did? And I'll leave it to you.
Thanks for those kind words. Wow. Why did I write this book? So the book is called Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. The subtitle was my publisher's idea. I was insistent about the title. So you can imagine kind of who they were aiming for, right? I think I wrote this book because I had questions about the Bible myself. I think I also, you mentioned kind of gentleness, Matthew. I think it was really important to me. There's so many books about deconstruction in the Christian market, right? Various versions of deconstruction. I mean, you can get really philosophical, you can get theological, you can have the memoir of falling away from faith. This book is not really any of those. I think I just really wanted to wrestle with a book that I deeply loved, the Bible, Genesis, in a way that was kind of gentle enough and probing enough to really create space for other people to have their own experiences with this book. I think it became very interesting to me to hear from other people, you know, in my other writing spaces. You know, I'm a Christian Century columnist. I've written and published all over the place, which is, I'm very happy to have been able to do that. Really grateful for that. But I think I wanted to make space because I heard from other people that they struggled with the Bible so much. Folks who had kind of walked away from certain forms of Christianity where generally you weren't allowed to ask questions, you know. So I have a friend who was literally kicked out of youth group for asking too many questions. And, this is like a kind of mainstream evangelical Southern Baptist church down in Texas, right? That's kind of its own brand of Southern Baptists, I believe. From what I've heard, I didn't grow up in Texas. Um, but I do think there are these churches, right? Still to this day, there are these denominations where asking questions is really dangerous. And so what ends up happening is you just don't even learn that there are other varieties of Christianity. There are no other flavors to what it means to be Christian. There's one way, one truth, one single interpretation of the Bible. And so what happens when you say, maybe I don't agree with that anymore? So a lot of people will just kind of walk away cold turkey, and I just kind of wanted to make a space for people, who needed sort of a gentler exploration, really. Like I wanted to tell them there are other ways to be Christian. There are other ways to read this text. So this book ended up being this kind of strange amalgamation of a creative writing project where I was going, okay, how do I bring creativity and sort of midrash to the Bible? How do I put stories up against these texts to make it unfamiliar? Because so many people are very familiar with Genesis stories. Not everybody is, but especially in Christian spaces, we're very familiar. So the unfamiliarity was important to me. It was also really important to create a gentle space, even for evangelicals who might, or fundamentalists, if they were brave enough to pick up this book, to just sort of nudge them, to tell them stories in such a way about the Bible, about how the Bible came to be, in a way that was very gentle, but did sort of poke and prod a little bit at some of those places where there are discrepancies, there are, issues in the text. There are changes in the text. There are changes that the scribes, an edit, from the scribes. I talk about in the book, Tikkun Sopharim. You can probably say it better than me, Michael, with your Hebrew background. But there's a correction of the scribes, in the Genesis manuscripts that we have. And these were, Jewish scribes who wrote this text down over and over, and they came to a part of the story and said, no, it can't be like that. I'm going to just switch these pronouns real quick. It's like that's, I didn't hear about that in evangelical churches growing up. And what does that mean then about kind of how much of God is in the text, and what level of even magic dust of God is in the text, that inspiration question. So anyway, I think all those things I wanted to poke a little. I have a little bit of the antagonist in me, I think. But I wanted to do it in a really gentle way.
It's really helpful. All right, if I jump in, Matthew. Okay, so if I can kind of follow up on that, I really enjoyed the book, and in fact, for those who don't know, I was actually quite intrigued that this is published by Erdman's, which is a very big publisher of pretty heavy biblical scholarship, right? One of my first books was published with Erdman's, and so to have anything published with Erdman's is a real compliment to your skill, especially like with the wealth of publishing you've done in lots of different other sort of contexts. So I was quite fascinated to just simply to have the chance to read something at book length from someone who has really explored lots of stuff at kind of more essay level kinds of things. So that was super intriguing. And so you're to be commended just on a group like Erdman saying, hey, this is a project we want to be behind. I loved how you started the book, and a couple of folks, at least on the call, probably know a little of my story just from having heard me teach and so forth in churches and such. But I was fascinated, probably in part because some intersections with my own story, and so I'd like to kind of ask you to kind of unpack a couple of things. So at the very beginning, really in the preface or introduction of the book, you say, I no longer see the value in securing the truth with superglue as evangelicalism seems to demand. And then you went on to say, my evangelical upbringing instilled in me a unique seriousness about my pursuit of God. And I thought, oh, that's a phrase that really resonates with me, that unique seriousness. That was certainly my experience from a young child till now. And I learned to seek, you say, I learned to seek God in community. So I'm grateful for this formation. I take it with me into new religious spaces, even as I've left evangelicalism behind. But I'm seeking a new method to read the old text, a method more curious and capacious. That's when I was like, oh, okay, this is a great writer. I love that word. Then the doctrine of inerrancy allows. My goal is the same as always. I want to commune with God. And I was like, wow, that's powerful. And then you said, but I'm no longer a good evangelical. I'm just wondering if you can sort of, I share whatever, feels comfortable and safe, but that's a story that I think is going to either concern some of your readers, right? What does it mean to leave evangelicalism, right? So bluntly at the beginning, but I think will also resonate for some of your readers who are really struggling to, either with the kind of theological expectations of evangelicalism, let's say, or the kind of some of the strictures that some of us grew up with, but then also perhaps the way evangelicalism has been, I think in some cases, sort of used or even weaponized in our current environment, right? In ways that seem a little bit scary, and we can talk about perhaps later. But just in general, kind of some of your story relative to evangelicalism and what this means to be looking for a new meaning in text so that you can commune with God. I just really resonated with that.
Yeah. I mean, so most of this book is a commentary on the first 2/3 of Genesis, Genesis 1 to 32. So creation of the world with God's own voice through Jacob wrestling with the God or angel or whoever, whatever that was.
Right.
We're not exactly sure, right? And so, when I started on that project, it was very much, I actually really just wanted to jump in, and my editor, wonderful writer herself, she really encouraged me to do some sort of introduction. And I was like, at the time I had just come off rounds of trying to sell a memoir. I was like, I'm so sick of my own voice. I don't want to use the I voice at all in this entire book. And both my agent and my editor were like, nope, you have to give some context, for who you are as a human. And so I wrote this note. And I didn't call it an introduction. I didn't call it a prologue. I called it a note to former and current evangelicals. Because I knew, other people would read this, maybe they would read it and they didn't have this background and they wouldn't have the same kind of hangups as a lot of evangelicals and former evangelicals do about the Bible. But I knew I would have to kind of address, I had people in mind. I had friends in mind, right? Where I was like, they're going to pick up this book and go, is Liz okay? Like, what is going on with this woman? I'm worried about my friend. But the reality is, I think I realized I needed to sort of come clean about, like, this is not an evangelical reading of the Bible. And what I would say about that is mostly, what has come up is that people have an issue with, like, the hierarchy of texts that I've kind of created. And we can talk about that, Michael. I bet that'd be something you're interested in talking about. But I just start this note. I used to be a good evangelical. And then I, list my laurels. Like, I went to Wheaton College, for example. I went to a Christian high school and middle school. I aced my Bible classes. I almost got a minor in Bible at Wheaton just because I was interested in Bible. So it was not like a casual interest for me. I was always very invested in faith. And I don't even think I got that necessarily from the churches that I was in, that my parents had brought us to, because they also were evangelicals. I think I brought my own level of kind of interest into that, and then became attached to some of the other folks and kind of movements within evangelicalism that took things very seriously. So, I would have probably at some point had read Jesus Freaks, and would have considered myself to be in that camp, or I would have, I listened to CCM music. I just kind of did whatever I could to kind of be in the center of what I thought faith was. Oh, I talked about dating Jesus. Yeah. So that was another part. I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but part of the purity culture movement, there was a moment where girls and young women were encouraged to give up dating altogether and just, Jesus as your boyfriend. And, let me tell you, Jesus was not actually a great boyfriend. Much better savior of the world than boyfriend. But I think, my questions about the Bible honestly did not come up for a very long time. Despite my upbringing, I think I just had this deep sense of certainty. The people around me were certain. And so I felt certain. Like I tell a story about arguing with a neighbor's mom in our neighborhood. We actually lived in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania at the time. So if you know Swarthmore College, I'm sure she was a professor related, and it's this actually very atheistic culture in that city. And so she started asking me about the Bible. She knew we were Christians. And I was 10 years old, and I was, she asked me, why weren't dinosaurs in the Bible? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. I knew it didn't matter. And I was certain my faith was secure, despite kind of her coming at me as, I was in fourth grade. Now I look at that a little different, because I've had a fourth grader. But I that sense of deep certainty, I think, is very evangelical. I think it's, and actually that's one of the kind of hypotheses from the book that comes out over time as I was exploring kind of what does the Bible mean to evangelicalism, and kind of how do we interpret it the way that we do? What is the very particular way that we come to this text, and how does that need to be disrupted? And by this text, I mean the Bible, but I specifically mean Genesis. I wanted to root everything that I was writing about in the actual text itself. And so I think, certainty became this undercurrent through the whole book. Like, what level of certainty can we have about God, about faith, about the Bible? Really so much of evangelical, I don't even want to call it theology. I want to say evangelical practice is about securing faith with superglue. It is a way of addressing fear and uncertainty in this life, and trying to make things that are fundamentally, ontologically uncertain, to make them stable and certain.
Almost with the assumption that if you don't super glue all the cards together, the whole house will begin to fall, right?
Well, and that is literally what people have said, right? Like it's you take one brick away, right? And then what will happen, right? So this is kind of the slippery slope argument. Like you start questioning women in ministry, right? I mean, it's like, what does that mean then about your faith? What does that mean about the way that you see God? All of a sudden, and that's kind of back to these more fundamental spaces where it wasn't okay to ask questions, right? Where my friend was kicked out of youth group. It's like, because he said, wait a second.
Yeah.
And the youth leader finally said, you and me and your parents are going to have a conference outside after youth group. Go sit outside in the hall.
Wow.
That was Zach Lambert. He has a book about the Bible. It's very interesting too. So you can imagine why. I mean,
yeah, for sure. That's great. No, I appreciate that so much. So let me shift gears a little bit. As you continue to go on, one of the things that you say at the beginning, right, in your sort of note to readers, is you say, I've written this book as an experiment in eisegesis, which anyone who's dealt with biblical scholarship before, I loved the boldness of that statement. As in, you say, reading life into the biblical text. My guides into this mode of textual criticism have been non-dominant culture theologians. I thought that was a very helpful kind of, there's a lot to unpack there, but I thought that was a very concise, helpful statement. In fact, I I mentioned to Matthew as I finished reading the book, I was like, oh my gosh, the book is a collection of wonderful aphorisms. I mean, that you've come up with. I mean, just like turns of phrase that really capture a lot of what's going on. So I wanted to push this a little bit because I agree with you, but I wanted to kind of have you kind of unpack for folks what you mean by saying I've written this book as an experiment in eisegesis. So as a biblical scholar, right, the sort of traditional way of understanding biblical scholarship was that it was what we called exegesis, right? That is to say, you lead out or you draw out the meaning that is in the text. And the way you do that is you read what's on the surface of the page very carefully in terms of genre and layout and rhetorical, things, how the grammar and the syntax fit together, all of those kinds of things, as well as attending to history and culture and language and philosophy of the ancient world out of which it comes, right? So that the assumption was, if I do that kind of exegesis, drawing that meaning out, the closer I get, there will always be questions to ask, but the closer I get to understanding the original culture, for example, out of which a text comes, the assumption was the closer I get to the author's intention of what they meant by that, right? When I was in graduate school 30 years ago, right, it was still at a point where that was the dominant way of thinking, at least at the institution I was at. And the idea of eisegesis, which would mean to not read something out of the text, but literally read something into the text, right, as the language in Greek suggests, was kind of a no-no, right? What's interesting is that has shifted in biblical studies to where now we recognize, and folks certainly at First Press in Berkeley, who have heard me teach a lot, right, have heard me say this ad nauseum, that part of the reality of interpretation is that we as readers are always bringing our own social locations, our race, our gender, our class, our educational backgrounds, our theological proclivities, or whatever the things may be, all the characteristics about ourselves. Those things are affecting what we see, right? But I recognize in a book where you're sort of starting out by saying, hey, there's some problems with this super glue approach, right? You're then boldly turning and saying, I'm actually going to introduce you to some legends by rabbis or some midrash, right? Some kind of wide open sort of wrestling with the text in ways that may not be literal, but may actually be how people have tried to make sense of God's word and do so by taking it seriously, but not necessarily in a mechanical, literal form. So my question is too rambling, but I guess I'd love to hear you kind of go further in just what you mean by eisegesis for yourself and kind of why you've embraced that. Because I think you're doing something that pretty much every biblical scholar now would agree with you on, but it is new for many of us that are in, have been part of evangelical sort of context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if you were to look up eisegesis on Google, to search for it on Google, it's like John Piper and
Yes,
John MacArthur who comes up, and it's,
Right.
This is heresy, right?
This is bad.
Which I did look up because I was very curious. And I sure would have loved to talk to them about it. Let's be honest. These are kind of just big theology words that don't mean as much as kind of how they're expressed. And so,
Well said.
because I was at Erdman's, I really wanted to make this as rigorous as I could, my exploration of Genesis. And I had lots of help, which was wonderful. But I think, my instinct is to tell stories. That is my modus operandi. Excuse me. So I think part of it was that I actually wanted to approach the text as a story first, so to come into it and say, these were characters, these are, ideas, these are plots and settings, and, to really kind of wrestle with the language and that's actually kind of an exegesis sort of instinct.
Absolutely.
And in fact, evangelicalism, it's exegesis all the way, like every sermon that I loved was exegesis. when I was a good evangelical, right? But I think there is this question about objective truth that comes up when you examine the Bible and really any work of art. One of the things that is very challenging about the book of Genesis is that there is very little that we know for certain about the historical context of Genesis. It is just a very ancient text. Part of what interests me about this book is that it's about sort of primordial encounters with God. Do we know if Adam and Eve are real? Who was Cain's wife? There are these big questions. What language? One of my favorite questions that the early church fathers were discussing was what was the first language? So you what language did Adam speak in the Garden of Eden?
It was King James English, I believe, right?
Yeah, you would think so. I think they settled on Hebrew, but again, what kind of Hebrew, right? Like,
absolutely.
And so again, you kind of run into these issues with the text where you're going, okay, there's some things we can verify. Like we can find ziggurats in the middle of the desert in Iraq that maybe have some resemblance to what the Tower of Babel could have been, right?
Right.
But we haven't found Noah's Ark, despite those news reports to the contrary, on Mount Ararat, like somewhere in Turkey, where someone claimed to find it via Google satellite. I don't know if you heard that story, but that's a fun one. But we really just do not have ways to check up on this stuff. And that is deeply unsettling as modern readers. We want to read from this sense of history, and we want to be able to pin down the facts, and we want to know exactly what the narrator meant. If you're in a literature course in college that is entirely about historical context, it's all about really the life of the author, right? What did they mean by this turn of phrase? Why did they make this character like that? Is that actually autobiographical? It's like a secret autobiography.
Right.
So I think a lot of what I am reacting to is I just really want to be upfront about the fact that I actually don't think we can read Genesis objectively. Like there are things, and this has been one of those clobber, really the entire book has been a clobber book, right? Not just clobber verses. It has been, this is what it means to have a healthy marriage. This is what it means to be a certain gender. This is the right kind of way to have a family. I mean, we have used these verses with such literalism as if they're kind of science spelled out. And in fact, when you read it, it's like, what did this mean? The rabbis believed that Adam was created as a transgender, intersex human. And then God split Adam down the middle to create Eve. That is a really different read, right? And so anyway, for me, I really wanted to know, okay, what have other people said about these texts? Because we know so little objectively. Let's just be honest about that.
Right.
We just don't know, right? Like we don't know whether the earth was created in 6 days. To be honest, I don't care. I don't find that to be an important question. My question is, why did God create at all? What does that tell us about the creator? What does that tell us about us and who we are and what God has called us to be and do? Those seem to be much more fundamental questions to me. And so we kind of go on these side quests, but I I just wanted to kind of address it right up front. And I will say on this topic of midrash, I was very inspired by Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. If anyone is familiar with her work, she is a midrashic scholar. She in particular studies Rashi, who's one of the most famous and most studied of the Jewish rabbis who have written kind of legends and commentary about the Torah in particular, but also the prophets and the law. And so she has gone through almost all of the Torah at this point with her own sort of rhetorical eisegesis approach. And I found her explanation of this so interesting. So she writes in her book, The Beginning of Desire, Reflections on Genesis. She says, My mode of inquiry was closer to the rhetorical than to the methodical in terms of Gerald Bruns's distinction. The rhetorical having no greater ambition than to discover what can be said in any given case. I am looking to loosen the fixities, the ossifications of preconceived readings. The aim of interpretation is, I suggest, not merely to domesticate, to familiarize an ancient book. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, to make strangeness in certain respects stranger.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's well said.
So it's not about domesticating God and God's text. It actually is about sort of rewilding the story,
right,
so that we approach this in a new way, so that we can actually meet the Spirit of God on God's own terms, which is very difficult to pin down, right?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. No, I think that's super helpful. And I will say that, one of the things I find in my own work is, and it is hard for me not to let the frustration of this kind of bubble over into my, my attitudes and my teaching sometimes, right? Is that I was never taught as a young evangelical that Christians had not always thought that this way, right? About, say, trying to make the Bible fit into scientific facts, or, that it was about the sort of objective facticity of things. And that it was just assumed that that's the way the Bible's always been read, right? And when I realized, early on in seminary that in fact, historically, those debates really didn't get running, at high speed, really until the 1910s, 1920s with the modernist fundamentalist kind of controversy. It sort of like, oh, wait a minute. It doesn't mean that, that the folks that were reading these texts didn't assume there was probably a real Adam and Eve, right? But the idea that was the point, right, just illustrates the fact that the questions we bring to the text are already going to delimit and prescribe the kinds of answers we're going to find, right? So if we go into it looking for, justification of our intellectual sort of, house of cards, right? We're going to find things that will either support that perspective or break it down and deconstruct it, right? But maybe the writers are doing something much bigger than that, right? And I think that, when biblical scholars talk about, myth in text, right, they don't mean it's false. They actually mean there's a surplus of meaning going on, right? That incorporates us, right? And so it's not just, well, who are the first two biological human beings, but in what ways are they like me? And am I literally replicating in my own daily life the very troubles that they ran into in effectively having a hand in destroying paradise, right? Precisely because of how they behaved, and how I behave, that's a whole different way of reading text that I think gives them
Well, and
a lot more life.
I mean, I would say that's an extension of the evangelical reading anyway. So much of what I was taught was like to kind of bring yourself to the text, but not bring yourself to, it was like, depending on kind of what circle I was in, and especially because I was a woman, it was like, you come to the Psalms, you take your nugget, you go with you. I remember kind of opening the Bible, just like seeing where it fell open, pointing a finger down, and that's where I would read my devotional for the morning, right? I think I think the natural outgrowth, though, of a very serious reading of the text says there is a context to this book. There is a context to the writing of the book, as well as the stories wherever they originated from, right? So these layers, right? So there's first the thing that happened, then there's the people writing about it and their reasons for writing it and how they write it. And now, there's people who are copying that and continuing to let that text live and breathe for future generations. And then now it comes to us, right? And so we are part of this long line of readers who've brought our voices to bear on this text too. I think the reality of that is actually so moving, in a culture where so much changes so quickly like ours, to have something so ancient, that my spiritual ancestors spent so much time, money, expertise. They spent entire lifetimes copying these words so that maybe eventually they could reach me, so that someone in the future could read this. I mean, I think something about that is just so sacred. And I think being able to have that whole line of people who took these words seriously, it doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily a reason, an authorial intent. But I think it actually means that we need to keep reading it for this moment. And that requires just a different lens and a different kind of acknowledgement of how we interact with the text. It's not a hermeneutically sealed book.
Right.
And I think it's meant to be like that.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And we're very uncomfortable with that. But I think that's how it's meant to be.
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, with my students, I mean, it's I don't want to say it's 100%, but scholars are pretty widely agreed, right? That these texts did not get written down by some eyewitness standing there watching Adam and Eve. That's clearly would go against the story. So, what leads people to explore, to write? I mean, your book is an illustration of this, right? At one level, we write things down when there's a crisis moment that forces us to kind of figure out what we think or what's been going on. I think that, I think it's important to recognize the Gospels probably wouldn't exist in the form that they do, at least until some of the earliest followers of Jesus in that first generation are now dying off, and they need to kind of figure out, well, how do we codify what we know about this guy, right? And most scholars, of course, as you know, would look at Genesis and say, the Babylonian exile in the 6th century had a lot to do, not just with Genesis, but most of what we call the Hebrew Bible, right? Would have been at least codified and edited and kind of, committed down to a sort of a textual basis, coming out of that crisis, right? As opposed to, so part of the joy of reading these texts, I think that you're illustrating is both to bring ourselves into it, also to recognize that there probably is some authorial intent, but the authorial intent and my expectation don't necessarily always line up, and that actually creates the confusion that you talk about and the doubt and so forth, perhaps. But I loved how you sort of turned those to say, hey, these are moments of mercy, these are moments of opportunity, right? If I can tweak a little bit and just, I'm just kind of keeping an eye on our time here. I want to kind of, I don't have a way to answer this altogether, but I want to kind of mention a couple of themes that 2 or 3 themes that you raise in the book, and just give you the carte blanche to midrash on those, if you would. So one of them would be, there's a couple here that you say at one point, I think this is on page 45, you say, doubt is just another word for imagination. And that was one of those aphorisms I thought I want to, write at the bottom of my email or something, right? My little, signature page. Doubt is just another word for imagination. And then you go on to say, can the believer adapt to change? It depends on whether the believer accepts change as normal or not. This is to say, spiritual change is normal. Doubt is not wrong, but essential. There's no authentic faith without it. Doubt is the way, I love this line, doubt is the way we add rings to the trunk. I thought that was just beautiful. And then you say, for example, regarding Adam and Eve, God arrives not with judgment, but questions, right? God shows up and says, hey, where you been? What are you up to? Why are you hiding? Right? Which I thought was just a fantastic observation. And then you go on to sort of talk through the book, a couple of related themes here. One is you say, we're all at some level foreigners to the Bible, and that we are therefore all potentially in danger of bringing our own fundamentalisms into our reading of the text, which I completely agree with that. And then the biggest point, and then I'm just going to let you do with this whatever you want. You say there's a great section here, and I think you're interacting with who is it? I guess it's not Buber. I guess at one point you talk about Heschel and so forth, but you talk about the rabbis in a particular legend, and you say God seems to be encouraging us to risk being wrong in pursuit of what's right. So being wrong is not the conclusion, God is, right? And then you talk about confusion and disillusionment being basically moments of mercy. I just found all of that to be providing me, as someone who has wrestled with this kind of stuff for years, you were providing me new language, I guess, to think of it, right? And language that doesn't feel so scholarly stilted, I guess, to, just you were using language like mercy and confusion and foreignness and the danger of fundamentalism and the fact that imagination is part of what this is about, right? Change being normal. Riff on any of that, because I found that all just super, super helpful, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it might help to tell that midrash. It's one of my favorite and has been very formative to me as I've been thinking about how do we approach the Bible when we realize that things are not as certain as we wish they were, including God.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the story of basically Moses is writing down the Torah in this midrash. So God and Moses are sitting at the top of Mount Sinai, and God is dictating, and Moses is transcribing, and God comes to the part in Genesis 1, I believe, let us make humankind in our image.
Right.
And Moses stops God and says, us, our, why give the heretics room? Why? And I think one of the things that I really want to find this actual verbiage, but the gist is God says to Moses, let him who errs, let him err. God is saying, let him who wants to make that error, let them do it. I think, I find that so fascinating. And, this is not a text from the Bible, right? This is not Holy Scripture that I'm telling the story. I think what I found so fascinating about this text, this comes from the Midrashic tradition. Jewish commentators argued for thousands of years about the Old Testament before we got a hold of it, right? Before Christians even got our mitts on it, right? Although you could argue, they were proto-Christians, some of them, but I think what's so fascinating about this story to me is that there is this sense among the Jewish commentators that God gives space for interpretation. So regardless of whether you think that is, I'm not saying that this is gospel truth by any means, but I am saying that there was an understanding among the community of God's people who were reading this text deeply, arguing over every word, every phrase, all the numbers that came up, right? There's a theory for everything. I mean, you can find whatever you want in the rabbinic tradition.
Right.
I spent quite a bit of time there and did not even scratch the surface of what there is to find. But I think what I found so fascinating is that there is just a totally different posture toward the scriptures that says, like, there is space here.
Right.
We don't have to be afraid. Like, part of what I realized is some of my own fear in asking questions was rooted in the sense of, what if God isn't okay with this? What does that mean for me and God? How does this change my relationship with God if all of a sudden I'm kind of wandering off by myself? Am I alone? If I'm asking these questions, what if I go the wrong way? And there's another quote by Simone Weil. She talks about, you can never wander too far without falling into the arms of Christ. If you're seeking truth, you will find. And we see that that reiterated over and over again. The story of Hagar is a great example of that, where Hagar literally goes into the desert and God seeks and finds her.
Right.
We see this at really one of the essential parts of the Midrash is this idea that God is for the pursued, not the pursuer. So like God is the pursuer, and God sides with the person who is the victim, the one who is pursued. And so there's this sense of kind of, when you are at your lowest, that's when God arrives. And I think that's true even when we doubt, even when we're afraid, there is room. There's a capaciousness. There is space for us to meet God and to trust that God wants to meet us in those questions. So I think that's probably a good summary of
Yeah, no,
trying to capture some of that.
No, I think that, I kind of threw a bunch of stuff at you. I apologize. I mean, but I think what you're saying, what strikes me is that this is a good reminder, right? Yes, you're reading Midrash, so you're not necessarily reading biblical text, but I think what you're showing and illustrating, right, is that if I can put it this boldly or bluntly, right, the Protestant imagination has been turned into something, at least the evangelical strains of that have been turned into something that's pretty sclerotic. That is, it kind of doesn't allow for a recognition that God's grace really is grace, right? And I'm thinking, like, just in the way the rabbis are reading the text, they're like, God's grace is already there. And they're illustrating that by suggesting, I mean, it reminds me of the kind of, sort of Martin Luther kind of, sin boldly sort of notion, right? That you don't tiptoe around a loving parent. You actually know that you've got arms to fall into when you make a mistake or go off track. And I find it so fascinating that, this may sound heretical in and of itself, but I am fascinated these days with the way that God, and this comes out a bit in your treatment of, say, the Tower of Babel, right? That God is all in on diversity. Yeah, but we keep trying to shove everything down into a single orthodox perspective, or, kind of imagine that somehow numerous and even discordant voices somehow are problematic. And I'll be honest, I'm always fascinated, when I read, say, wisdom literature in the Bible. This is not Genesis, of course, but when you read Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes and put them together, you realize they're actually arguing with each other about, what God's perspective is, right? And I love the fact, I mean, just for a second, I love the fact that when Job's three friends have been basically quoting the theology of Proverbs to Job, right? Job keeps saying, no, that doesn't work. And then at the end, right, God shows up and says, hey, you three friends, you need to go have Job pray for you, and maybe I'll forgive you for misspeaking about me. And they were quoting Proverbs. I mean, I find that just fascinating. And that's all in the Bible. That's not even Midrash, right? So it's I think that capacious thing you're seeing is phenomenally important.
And that's not to say there's not fundamentalism in Judaism, by the way.
Absolutely.
There is fundamentalism in Judaism.
Yeah,
but absolutely. I think what's interesting about the entire Midrash is that there is such a diversity of opinion. I mean, I think we don't, and this is the same with Christian tradition. We just kind of, in some traditions, you're not even taught that there's another way to think, that there is a tradition of a different way of thinking. And probably I agree with you. I mean, I think those different voices are so essential.
So one of the last things you do, and this I think was my favorite part of the book, honestly. It in terms of the way you were engaging the biblical text, right? I mean, I loved it all, but this really struck me. You get into the story of Jacob, right? And Jacob wrestling, as you mentioned earlier, right? And the way that, you know, at least the kind of popular biblical etymology sort of implies that, you know, Israel now means, in effect, right, that we are the ones who strive or struggle or wrestle with the divine. That is part of what this is. And I thought what you did with this was fascinating, because you point out the fact that Jacob goes through pain on the way to being able to wake up in the morning and see the light and see God in a way that had never been possible before. And you have some just beautifully poetic sort of phrases in there where you talk about, you know, you have to have the dust flying around in the wrestling match with God in order to encounter, right, the who God is, to commune with God, to experience that love that's been waiting for you there all the time. I just found that kind of a brilliant take. And again, you were weaving back and forth between Midrash and sort of your own insights. And I just found that really helpful. So like, how would you, I guess what I want to give Matthew a chance to jump in here next, but I guess my last question would really be, if you were to talk to, you know, an evangelical, let's say, or me, who is struggling to try to figure out what to make of this Genesis text, and let's just take sort of Jacob, how would you help me move beyond, right, a kind of, did it happen that way? Did it not? Was it an angel? Was it God? Right? All of the kind of mechanical questions I might ask, and take me down into what you're seeing in that kind of poetic and imagery sort of piece.
I think it's probably related to even how we ask the question, right? So my favorite questions are how and why, you know, because I think they get at these kind of bigger, deeper, more human questions, like beneath the surface. I think I would probably ask them, you know, why is it important that this happened a certain way? Because I think that's some of it, right? Is like our own psychology of fear and uncertainty, fear of uncertainty. So I think, you know, and I try really hard not to answer the historical questions in the book because I think plenty of people do that.
No, that was admirable. I thought that was great.
I mean, nobody really needs me to do that. There are other people who try to do that. And I think it's a boring question. You know, my questions are more about, why does this matter? Why did my ancestors even care about getting this text to me? What does this teach us about what God is like? You know, I think some of those kind of bigger questions, and I think these are kind of artist questions. You know, I kind of wonder too about like, you know, we've read the Bible one particular way for a long time within American Christianity. And it's not a bad way to read the Bible. I'm talking about this historical critical method, which is very important for reading the Bible with a context. And because it's such an ancient text, we need the historical context to understand it. I mean, we literally don't even speak the same language that this was written in originally, right? To say nothing of geography, culture, even like our bodies are different, right? I mean, there's just so much about encountering these texts that is foreign. But you know, it seems very important that we be able to make space for other sorts of reading. So I talk about, you know, an enslaved people, as they read the Bible, they had to come to the text with more nuance than we as white Christians, white American Christians, probably ever had to. because of their particular circumstance. And they just had an understanding of what it meant to come with a deeper kind of nuance to say, like, what is God actually like? Not like, what does this mean in its minutia? You know, can I verify that this happened? But like, does God care that I'm enslaved? You know, so there are just these really different and more urgent questions. And so I found myself really inspired by these kind of survivor narratives, you know, you know, when someone has really gone through something and then encounters this story, how does that change how they read the story? You know, we need both this kind of academic reading, we need this personal reading, we need this survivor reading, we need like these different identities who experience God in these different ways, because God is not one thing, right? God is diverse in God's self in the Trinity. So anyway, I could talk about that all day long, because that's one of my soapboxes probably, but
I love it.
yeah, I've found that very inspiring to look at it in through these different lenses myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things you're raising for me that's really helpful is the idea that I'll put it this way. I was raised to think that the way you approach the Bible is you look for the answer. The point is drive toward the answer. But there was never, in my early growing up, there was never a sense that God delights in the fact that I am curious and that I have questions, and that those are not bad things, right? I was raised very much to be afraid of my own questions. You talked about your friend being kicked out of youth group. I was probably a little of that, at least as I developed. And I think, yeah, that's super helpful that we get, part of what the Bible, I think, is bidding us to do is do the why and the how questions, just like a little kid. That is part of the joy of living. But if we approach it just as a kind of like, let's just get past all the muck and get to the answer, as if that's going to somehow, solve God for us or something, then we're creating a very small God, right? That is ultimately mystery. So I appreciate getting a chance to chat with you. I want to make sure, Matthew, you can kind of guide us here in terms of time and so forth. I think we're right at about 6:00, so that's probably pretty good.
Whew. Thank
Bless
you
you.
very, very, very much. Yeah, thanks. I was I'm going to read this in a little comment. I maybe cold brain. I think it was important to me. Excuse me. In terms of thinking about how we view God and how God views us and asking questions. So on page 42 to 43, you say this: regret is desire disappointed. The Creator desired that the beings would welcome the abundance ordered by a Creator who needed nothing and yet gave everything. God's desire is exposure. Because God desired us, we discover that we can bruise our Creator. We can disappoint and reject. Our punny actions, both done and undone, rend the heart of the Creator and sever our relationship with divinity. And I sometimes think, when I hear people talk about God is wholly other, God is wholly other, I think that's kind of the aforementioned stuff that goes along with Hammered. It's because it takes away from this personality aspect. And if we can actually hurt God, like, I think sometimes I know some really good people, and I think to myself, sure, we're delivered and we're saved by Jesus. Okay, yes. But if God's only liking that person because Jesus died for that person, and Jesus doesn't die, and God doesn't like that person otherwise, I don't believe in that God. That's not cool. I have a problem with that God, because that's a really good person. I know that's a really good person. Anyway, that was kind of the comments. I apologize. That was just the comments, not really a question. Thank you so very much for this. There is some questions coming in, and I'm gonna try. Excuse me.
Poor guy.
Okay.
By the way, I love all the comments. So thank you both for your thoughtful engagement.
Absolutely. It's an honor.
Thank you, Michael, for taking this. So that was really wonderful. You are always so engaging. And yeah, thank you very much. And of course, Liz, also for that. Okay. Do you see value in reading scripture through the lens of tradition, like Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses? Also, have you experienced non-literal readings to still nourish your soul and mind personally?
Great question. I love that. So the question was, have I found use in literal readings, right? And then have I also been nourished by them? Yes and yes. I mean, this is one of the things that's true about the Bible is I think there are ways that you can approach different scriptures different ways, right? So for example, a more literalist reading of the prophets would say that the rich, the religious authorities, those are generally the people that God is mad at, right? because of their love of power. And I think that there are parts of the scriptures that we can read that way. I'm not going to tell you which ones those are because to be honest, I'm not qualified, number one. But I would also say, I think it is a discussion for community to have together to say kind of what are the parts, what is kind of the central theme? What is God as we see? What is true about God all through the scriptures? What do we see as kind of a central theme? And one of the things that I have found helpful, I think a friend told me this. He talked about how we can marginalize or center different passages. And I think the ones that we center, we probably do read more literally, right? Like we might read the life of Jesus more literally. We might read the prophets more literally. We might read, right? So there are kind of other ways that we can approach the text. But I think the thing that I'm trying to say here is not that a literal reading is always wrong, but that when we approach the text with a fundamentalism that says we have the single answer, we could miss what is happening. And so we need the voices of other people to provide context and a wider lens. I do think some people, might have more experience reading the scriptures, right? There could be times that we say, maybe this voice is a little bit less, seems to not actually kind of jive with the community interpretation, like the traditional understanding. But I think it's very important to me to broaden the table in general. So for example, generally in, seminaries in the United States, men are the primary commentators taught. So when you take a Bible course, you're going to read mostly white men, European descent. I think we should ask questions about that. We should say, why is it that we're reading from one certain lens and just saying that this is where the conversation can happen only. You see what I'm saying? So there's kind of there's a sense here where I kind of want to just encourage us. What does it look like to open the conversation? To say there are parts maybe we're reading literally. What does it look like to read them a different way? Have other people read them a different way? Does that align with what God says about God's self through the rest of the scriptures? Do you see what I'm saying? So there's sort of like a way that we can kind of read into the text too. But yeah, I'm not a fundamentalist about that either.
Well, if I can just parenthetically kind of add here, I mean, one of the things that I've always tried to say is we can't forget that truth is not a literary genre, right? That is to say, the text can communicate truth, but part of the problem is if I go to the text assuming, okay, because it's God's word, it's all truth, right? And the way I think that's going, what that means, right? If I read the New York Times assuming that I'm going to get the same kind of information that I would on the comics page or something, I'm literally going to misread that text trying to read it literally, if that makes sense, right? In other words, so a literal reading, only is literal if that's the genre into which it's put is a kind of, just read this off the surface of the sentence that's portrayed. So anyway, yeah, just I loved what you're saying. The other piece is you were talking kind of about power, about white male European interpreters and so forth. I wondered if, and I don't want to keep it from other questions, but I wondered, as I was reading your book, I was thinking about the famous and really important womanist scholar, so Black feminist scholar Renita Weems, and she has this statement in a phenomenal article about the Hagar story, actually, where she says, "It's not texts that have authority." And the minute, my kind of latent evangelicalism goes, whoa, wait a minute, the text has authority, right? But she says, it's not texts that have authority, it's people who have interpretations of those texts that are authoritative. In other words, what she means is our practice in the community of faith, is that we assume that the person who has the right to interpret this text and to do it officially for the rest of us, right? That makes the text authoritative. But in fact, it's the fact that we believe this person or this approach or whatever is what's authoritative. And I thought that was a really helpful distinction that felt to me like something you were playing out throughout the book, right? As a kind of basic insight. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah.
All right, Matthew, I'm done interrupting.
Okay, no. That's great interruption. How can we engage friends with more rigid fundamentals of beliefs, like, say, a 6-day creation, in a way that invites openness without dismissing their certainty, and still fosters mutual respect, mercy, and shared faith?
I love that question. So I went to the Ark in Kentucky recently with my 6-day creationist in-laws and my husband and children. And that was an experience. But I think one of the things I find really interesting about that, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a recreation of Noah's Ark that a Christian millionaire has built in Kentucky. He's also building a Tower of Babel, which to me feels like, bad idea based on the previous texts. But anyway, that's kind of up to him there. But it's interesting because I do have relationships with folks like this, who have very different views than me, including people I care about a lot, like my in-laws. And so, for me, it's been very important to find just a way of being with them that allows them to be themselves too. I think it's helped me a lot to realize often what is behind some of those beliefs is fear. It also might be kind of a sense of, certainty. They feel a sense of, they're convinced. But it is a stretch. If you go to the museum and hear their arguments, it's a stretch intellectually. So I think what's actually a lot more important than trying to change someone's mind or argue with them is actually just to kind of be with them and allow them space. Ask them questions if you want to. But I think just being a person nearby them with a different perspective, I think itself is a challenge, a challenge to their belief. The fact that you don't agree, I think itself is a way of just kind of saying, the fact that they know this, there's another way of thinking out here, so they may have their moment too, where they kind of come to the end of that system of belief, and you're going to be a person they can trust, So I just kind of counsel patience in relationships like this, because I think a lot of us have that. If you are in North America right now, there's some big political things in the wind. And I think a lot of us have family members on different sides. And so, like, patience, I think, is the key thing. Like, you can have all your opinions. I block my family members so that I can say whatever I want online. And I tell them not to read my work if they don't want to, because it might, be difficult for them because they know I disagree with them about things. But I still want to be in their lives, And so I kind of set my own boundaries around that. But I think that patience piece is the key. Yeah. Say you're going to stick it out with this person regardless.
And it sounds like you're also saying to show up in life with curiosity. I mean, that's what I heard in your book is like, what happened to curiosity as I read even the Bible, right? And allowing curiosity rather than going in and saying, I'm going to change your perspective, right? But
yeah.
but
It's more interesting
recognizing,
to ask, why do you think that?
yeah.
That's a more interesting conversation right away, right? Than like, well, let's debate the tenets of 6-day creationism, right? That totally misses the person. If you can actually get in the room with them and say, tell me more about why this is compelling to you. What need is it meeting for you? You might not be able to ask that question. That's a little direct, but I think, yeah, the curiosity to say, you're a person I care about and I want to understand you. And I don't have to be right in this conversation. I just have to be here.
Let's you're talking about how making and taking joy and creating joy through making amidst grief and loss and chaos and pushback reminds me of protest against chaos, a type of preserving stance for maintaining hope in something good. Can you talk about how we can continue to cultivate that belief in good?
This is something that I am currently still trying to mine and discover. But I do think these relational connections, that's some of what this is coming back to, right? Like, how do you have relationships with people who are different from you? How do you kind of maintain your own sense of self in the midst of that? And just speaking for myself, this political moment for me has been difficult. I have a lot of anxiety about it, and other people might have different thoughts and feelings about that, but I've talked to quite a few folks who are in the same boat. And so I think the way that I have learned to walk through any sort of chaos, pain, suffering in my own life has been kind of the same ordinary practices of moving my body, being around other people who know me, and really telling them how I am. That's confession, right? That's repentance. That's also just human interaction. I think these like real life connections with people, I think moving my body, because I get in my head. And so being able to be in my body instead, I'm have been a big gardener. I have chickens, like I puzzle. I actually have lots of old lady hobbies. I'm just getting a jump start on that. Because I also knit. So anyway, but doing things that are joyful for you. And I think I didn't learn the value of play when I was growing up as a firstborn in a dysfunctional family within evangelicalism. Just for whatever reason, that kind of mix of things, I didn't learn how to play well. So for me, that has been an adult learning. What does it look like to do things that I enjoy? Spend time with my husband, my kids, spend time. I live in Colorado. It is stunning. But I guarantee you where you live is stunning, right? Like, does the sun shine there? Yeah. Sometimes anyway, depending where you live in the world, but just like enjoying these very physical sensations, because that also is where God is. God is not just kind of in our minds. God is in this sensory experience. God gave us senses. God gave us taste buds. there's just so many things about this life that are just gift. And so I think reorienting around those smaller moments, I think that's really essential to say that matters too. Like I, for example, absolutely adore the Nuggets basketball team, the Denver Nuggets. And so like, we're going to get a subscription to the outrageously expensive proprietary stream for the Denver Nuggets this year. And you know what? That is worth it. I am delighted to get to watch this huge Serbian man throw a basketball around. Like it makes no sense really, but I think just being able to really enjoy those moments. So I love that insight, by the way, Ed. That's beautiful. The one certainty that I get from Genesis is that God is deeply relational, far more than I am. Man, I agree with that.
I think this question could be to both of you. Is you mentioned earlier being influenced by non-dominant cultural theologians. Could you let us know who they are for further reading? And just I'll mention this at the bottom of the so when this comes up available on the webpage, underneath it says authors mentioned, books mentioned, and so everything you mentioned will be named underneath, and you can also email me afterwards. So because I always find it useful, you're listening to something, you go, wait, who's that again? And so now we have conveniently added those things for people to read.
You want to go first, Michael? What
Not
are yours?
Not at all.
What is your list? Well, what's in your list? I mean, how do you diversify when you're teaching and preaching? How do you diversify what you
I don't really preach. I teach a lot, but I would say, I would say this, when I get a hold of, authors who are, either from different cultural perspectives, right? And that would include things like, Latin American liberation theologians, for example, who have been very influential in my way of sort of not only relating to God and to the deepening of my faith, but also even kind of rescuing some parts of my feeling like, wow, this narrow faith that I grew up with is inadequate. So that would be probably the biggest sort of subset. I think I have been influenced by lots and lots of different scholars. I would say, African American scholars, Renita Weems is one, James Cone is another. I could go off and list a whole bunch for sure. I think the other thing I would say is that, reading folks, for example, Phyllis Tribble, right, who comes at Genesis and particularly Genesis 2 and 3 very famously in a way that illustrates, right, that the questions that an interpreter brings to a text naturally and inescapably lead to the kinds of things they're going to see in a text, as we've already talked about. I mean, she does things illustrating the problematic typical white male readings in conservative, fundamentalist circles that might say, for example, well, Eve was created, second, and therefore she is less important than Adam, without recognizing that if you're going to go with that sort of, call it birth order, importance, then you have to go back and reread Genesis 1, in which human beings are the last created, right? And I don't think anybody would say, that we are less valuable than the birds because the birds come first in Genesis 1 and the birds come last in Genesis 2. That doesn't wash, right? And things like that have been just helpful for kind of seeing new things, right? So, I mean, I could list a whole bunch of sort of individual authors perhaps, but I think I would say mostly for me, it's folks who have, and you mentioned this, right? Folks who have struggled and felt pain underneath the wheels of the culture, right? So I would say too, the last piece I would say is I make a very strong point of, I don't just read. In fact, in some ways I probably rarely read straight up sort of biblical scholarship. I read very widely in, African American authors today that are sort of pushing questions of justice in our society. I read very widely in stuff around Christian nationalism and a lot of the power dynamics that you're talking about, trying to think about how what it looks like to be faithful in these moments as a person toddling after Jesus, and not trying to replicate or at least separate myself a little bit, right, from that sort of assumption that, well, because we have cultural power, we should continue to maintain that and bolster that and so forth in ways that I think have been really problematic since the 4th century, right? I think it's almost made it impossible for us Westerners, or at least a lot of North Americans, in at least white North Americans. I think it's very hard for us to read the Sermon on the Mount anymore in a way that it would have sounded to Jesus, those pursued folks you were talking about, that Jesus was clearly talking to when he first gave a thing like that, So anyway, that would be my a few thoughts.
Yeah, great thoughts. I was thinking, I'll give you a little list. I also very influenced by James Cone. Howard Thurman is probably top of my list at this point. He was basically MLK Jr.'s pastor.
Amen.
So the theology of the civil rights movement comes from Howard Thurman. Dolores S. Williams was a primary source for me talking about Hagar. She wrote this phenomenal book called Sisters in the Wilderness and really she founded womanist theology with this book, just the way that she wrote it from the perspective of Black female experience. Wilda Gaffney remains one of the most, I would say, like, if there's one person you're going to read, I would read Wilda right now, because Dr. Gaffney is just doing phenomenal work in kind of midrashic spaces from a womanist perspective. She's just phenomenal. Let's see. I mentioned Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. She's a fantastic midrashic scholar. So especially for folks who are wanting to learn more about Torah and how Jewish folk read some of the First Testaments, or read the First Testament, she's totally your gal. Phyllis Tribble, of course. I was reading Simone Weil, Gustavo Gutierrez, Rashi. And I actually spent a lot of time with the patristic fathers, because there's this fantastic commentary, and I think it goes through, gosh, I think they have one for all the Old Testament books. I'm not sure if they've done New Testament. I think it's an ongoing series, but they compiled all the early church father writings on different books. So that is a fantastic resource. I also found a midrashic resource that I found to be incredible as well. It's called Sefaria.com, Sefaria. And that is just a huge, vast library of writings. You can literally type in a verse and see what different rabbis have said about it. Now, some of it is in modern Hebrew, and you will not be able to read it, but often folks get on there and translate it. So that's fascinating to me too. So I've found some really fascinating sources, and I'm telling you, there's so much here. I even found Freud has written about Moses. I was like, he wrote a whole book about Moses. Who knew? So I felt like, as I got into this, I was like, I'm really fascinated to see how these things connect with culture as well. Because of course they all have their own lives. Some of these stories have their own lives kind of in culture over time too, which is a totally separate pursuit, right? So anyway, this is probably a good place to start.
Beautiful.
Cool. I will get those in. because we're kind of getting towards the end and it is a bigger topic. I goofed on kind of the original question. I think it's actually is an important question. I'm going to reword this in a proper way that gives honesty to it. Is there legitimacy in reading the text through tradition? Because in reading your book, I mean, obviously we have the Bible, we have Bibles there. Like, so you're not like, you guys, neither of you be like, oh yeah, no, tradition is stupid. And the way I worded it, it could have been seen as, so it's, is there legitimacy in reading text through tradition? For example, reading it through the interpretive lens of the church fathers.
Yes, definitely. Still. So, as I said, I mean, I think if you've read the early church fathers, it's often very funny to see how they interpret things because they get really metaphorical, and everything becomes sort of a allegory. So it gets like really allegorical, and you're kind of like, you're a little closer to the source here. Could you talk to some of them and get some more historical information in there, please? But that's just not how they read. You know, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about different cultures approaching these texts, they just draw out different things. You know, so like, am I going to read the story of Abraham and Sarah allegorically? Absolutely not. But I guarantee you that there are, you know, probably a dozen early church fathers or more who do. You know, we're supposed to be like, you know, we're not supposed to be like Sarah, and we are supposed to, you know, so it gets like very moralistic. And anyway, I think it just takes discernment in community to wrestle through kind of how to read these texts. But I think tradition is very important. I always ask the question, like, whose tradition and how do we decide what is tradition? You know, there's often a hierarchy of texts that happens. And so then how do we make that hierarchy, right? Like, who gets to be tradition? That's sort of the deeper question that I would ask. So anything you want to add, Michael?
I think that's really helpful. I mean, I would definitely say, yeah, yeah, I loved what you said about the church fathers and mothers, right? Because they have no, what's the word, compunction, right? About sort of saying, this text, I mean, what I find fascinating is they have no problem saying this text can't be taken literally. So I'm going to assume that there's a spiritual meaning behind this, right? And then they end up allegorizing or moralizing lots of things in ways that I think if people were more familiar with them, they would be scandalized, right? To realize that's what we mean by, you know, the early Orthodox folks, right? I think the other piece I would say about tradition is, yes, one, I don't think there's any way not to read within tradition, right? Whether you've been raised Baptist or Catholic or, you know, agnostic or atheist or whatever, we're all bringing those traditions in. I think the way I would put this, and I want to be careful about how I frame this, is I think we have to acknowledge that we're reading with our traditions, whatever those may be, and that we probably need to hold those a little bit lightly at times, right? That is to say, not living into them, if I can use a double negative, right? But rather that we're going to recognize that if, you know, I mean, I read the text and, you know, I'm coming at it as a modern scholar or as a, you know, out of that tradition or as a member of the Presbyterian Church USA. That is kind of how I, you know, where I locate myself. That's going to have some influence on that. But I teach at a Catholic school, and I love the fact that, you know, in Catholicism, there's no problem, you know, with learning and science and faith, right? Those things are mutually informing in that tradition. And I didn't grow up that way. So part of what I've found helpful is actually to not simply lock into a single tradition, but to be learning from others. It blew my mind when I learned that Genesis 2 and 3 in the Jewish tradition really isn't understood as a a fall of humanity. You know, that's a very sort of Christian reading of that. And I don't therefore say that that's necessarily wrong, but there's other ways and really powerful ways of reading that text that are very different, right? So using tradition, both kind of small t in a broad sense and one's, maybe ecclesial tradition, right, in a more narrow sense. I think all of those are in play. But what you're raising, I think, is so important is how important it is to have multiple voices from different perspectives, right? Because if our traditions, particularly our ecclesial traditions, are rooted in, very narrow handing down of white male, European historical critical method kind of thing, we're only going to see so much, right? And God's too mysterious and too beautiful to limit it to that. So I completely agree with you.
In a sense, you're saying to read the text ecumenically, and I think that's right on. That's all. Now we can wrap up.
Thank you both so very much for this. Liz, for your book. I hope it does fantastically well. And
Thank you.
And thank you, Michael. And I know, Michael, you've got some books. You've always got a book coming in the hopper, and we look for maybe another conversation, because I think people are generally interested in this. And they're interested in it because I was saying, and maybe his name is a curse word, but in some fundamentalist households, you mentioned names like the generous orthodoxy or Rob Bell. Ooh. Now I don't know what he's like now, but I think to myself sometimes, oh man, if some fundamentalists, if only they would have read Rob Bell, they actually might be okay. Instead, I mean, either this was mentioned right at the beginning, maybe before we started, but this idea of like the brick thing. So instead of, you take out one brick out of the fence and the whole thing is shot to hell. That's horrible. That's terrible. And really, it should be this elastic thing. And so the way you had, Liz, and you, Michael, as well, in presenting something that, like, given elasticity, something that's so much bigger than us, that is a real service to our time and our placement in history, and it's really, really needed. So thank you very, very much. And for the people who have come, thank you very much. Thank you for putting off my hacking, and we look forward to more. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you all. Thanks, Liz, very much.
Thanks for having me. Bye, guys.